This is For Keeps, a podcast about collections and connections. I'm David Peterkowski. This is a collector's story that has it all. An enthusiast whose passion for collecting began when he was young, the evolution of that passion into several lucrative business ventures, and in recent years, the selling off of much of that historically monumental collection to fund the creation of a new historical monument. And at the center of this story is a man I like to call the collector-in-chief. The man in question is Jim Warlick, and he's a self-described political entrepreneur whose life has been one steeped in memorabilia, particularly pieces related to the American presidency. Based in the Washington, D.C. area, Jim has spent much of his life amassing a collection of presidential memorabilia that's a tribute to those who've held the highest office in the land. His collection has grown alongside, and as part of, his various politically themed business endeavors, which have included a gift shop near the White House, traveling exhibits that celebrate the presidency of John F. Kennedy, an ice cream parlor with flavors named in honor of various presidents, and even 5 fully outfitted, life-sized Oval Office replicas that he rents out to TV and film productions. By crossing the aisle from political enthusiast to political entrepreneur, Jim has built up an incredible collection that began, humbly enough, with campaign buttons, some of which have ended up in the Smithsonian. Over time, his chain of memorabilia shops did well, enabling Jim to acquire 2 707 plane fuselages that he decked out in the style of Air Force One, filling one with Kennedy memorabilia and the other with items relating to the presidency of Ronald Reagan, taking them both out on tour. Among the items that Jim has collected over the years are 2 vehicles that transported Kennedy during his fateful visit to Texas shortly before his assassination in Dallas. Jim tracked down telephones that were specially installed in JFK's Texas hotel room, as well as JFK's shaving kit, clothing that belonged to Kennedy and his wife Jackie, and more. He also acquired hundreds of items that belonged to Franklin Delano Roosevelt, including a lapel pin, items from his desk, and photographs that he acquired from the estate of FDR's assistant, Grace Tully. But in recent years, Jim has sold off many of his most valuable presidential pieces, only it hasn't been for personal gain. In perhaps his most personally meaningful nod to history, Jim has taken the proceeds from selling some of his most valuable presidential memorabilia and bankrolled the creation of a historical monument in his small hometown of Morganton, North Carolina. The monument, entitled Dignity of Work, was dedicated in May 2023 and honors the collective efforts of thousands of mill workers in his home state. And among the workers featured prominently in the 22-foot-long, 10-foot-high monument is his late mother, Mary, who worked for 33 years in a local hosiery mill. It seems that, for Jim, the office of the presidency is worthy of celebration, but the workers who gave their all as part of America's industrial legacy are also worth a salute all their own. Long before Jim had even a single Oval Office full of memorabilia, he was a young boy captivated by the power of politics. On a fateful trip to D.C. in 1965, he picked up his first piece of presidential memorabilia.
I'd loved politics as a kid, and I argued with kids arguing politics. And actually, I lived out in the country, and we had a little country store. And in old country stores, guys come in, sit around the potbelly fire, and they talk. And so I would go out to the store, and I would argue politics with the old guys in the community. And they loved me, and I loved them, but I loved to argue with them. So in 1965, my aunt and uncle were going to come to Washington to see their son, who was studying at the Naval Academy. And we went to the 4th of July to the big event down on the mall at the Washington Monument. And earlier that day, I had picked up a little bust of John Kennedy. It was my first souvenir, and I got to visit John Kennedy's gravesite. He had been buried 2 years before that there. And I said, I'm going to live in Washington, D.C. one day. And so little did I know that my store is located, the White House gift store, literally almost the same location where that little gift shop was in 1965, because I remember getting it right across from the White House. So that hooked me on coming to Washington, D.C.
Eventually, Jim did move to Washington, but his path to the Capitol started closer to home in North Carolina.
As a kid, I would get my Little League baseball team to the leaflet cars in the summer. We had the primaries in the summer. And so I would get them on Saturdays. We would cover every car in town with a flyer for the candidate that my dad supported and family supported. So that hooked me too, because one election in 1964, the candidate for governor, Richardson Pryor, who later became a federal judge and also a congressman and headed up the committee to investigate the Kennedy assassination. So I had put out leaflets for him, and he lost in the runoff primary, but I took full credit for him winning my county because we had leafleted all the cars downtown. So that hooked me too. And then when I was in college, I dropped out literally 3 times to work in political campaigns and ended up traveling with 2 U.S. Senate candidates in North Carolina in races with Jesse Helms on the other side. And I came to Washington and went to work in a congressional office. And I hated that part about it because I thought I was going to go to Washington and be able to influence the congressman on political issues. But they have a staff of about 30, so I was way down the totem pole. And so I transferred back to Western North Carolina, Asheville, to kind of be a political aide for him, kind of the eyes and ears on the ground. And so I got to travel with him when he would come home on weekends and we had to go do events. So I got to travel all over the mountains with Congressman Gudger.
And while you're doing all this, if I understand correctly, you're starting to collect political items. Is that right?
Right. I kept collecting. I started collecting when I was a kid. And then in one of the U.S. Senate campaigns, we had bought a little badge a minute button machine. And so when the campaign was over, they said, what are we going to do with that? So I said, I'll take that. And so I used that to hand press out buttons, things that I had designed for campaigns. And in 1980, I wanted to go to a national convention. And the Republican convention was in Detroit, 1st of August. And then 2 weeks later, the Democratic convention was to be in New York City, been Carter's second convention. And so I go to design buttons for Reagan, 5 buttons. I designed 5 for Carter. And I thought, well, I'll go and I'll get a cheap hotel, which I did, $28 a night. And I stood out in front of Cobo Hall in Detroit with my little tie and my sports jacket and my art board with my buttons on it, and sold buttons to people that came by. And I made more money in a week than I did in a year with my congressman. I came home, told the congressman that I was going to go on the road selling buttons. I'll get to see the country. I'll get to be at presidential rallies every day. I could do a Reagan rally one day, a Carter the next. And I had never traveled much. And so it gave me a chance to go to Chicago, Nashville, New Orleans, California, everywhere. So I traveled. I got to see the country, got to hear the speeches, and my buttons, the Smithsonian came by and at one rally and bought all my buttons to put in their collection. That hooked me into collecting more memorabilia. And so with that, then I started my own business producing campaign materials for campaigns. I ended up over the years doing 13 presidential campaigns, all the campaign material. And that would be buttons and stickers, the yard signs, brochures, little newspapers and everything. And so I had candidates all over the country. I think I did almost 300 congressional campaigns, 13 presidential, a lot of Senate, a lot of governor's races. So it grew and grew, and I had a pretty big staff then doing that.
But the allure of D.C. proved too strong for Jim to ignore. So he relocated back to the Capitol, and it was there that he turned his passion for political buttons into a retail venture.
I was in the old train station, Union Station, had been renovated in 1989, and it was beautiful. And they had these little kiosks just a little small display case. I said, I'd like to sell political memorabilia. Well, nobody, knew if it would sell or not. So I had this little kiosk. People came through going to the Columbus room in the old train station for fundraisers. And Bill Clinton used to come by when he was governor of Arkansas. He was a Truman collector, and he would always buy all my Truman campaign memorabilia. Well, I then went to a bigger store, an inline store, and within a couple of years, it was the biggest producing per square foot. It was only 400 square feet, but it was doing like $1,600, I remember, per square foot. It was booming. And I ended up then going to Boston, Faneuil Hall and Quincy Market area, opened a store there, and they were called Political Americana. And I opened one in Baltimore at the harbor, one in Chicago at the Navy Pier, and I had one in Georgetown in Washington and one near the White House. So I had 6 of these political memorabilia stores at one time. And so we sold everything. Everything was all original: campaign posters, signed pictures by presidents, buttons, anything that had been used in campaigns or in a presidency. So I had to constantly find these things to outfit 6 stores. And so that was a job. I had to travel a lot and go to shows and buy memorabilia and come back. And, if I bought it for $3, I would put a 1 in front of it, 3, and sell it for 13. So I wouldn't even re-tag it. I would just put a number in there. And so it became a big hit.
Jim's connection with Bill Clinton extended into the Clinton presidency, both from a professional and a personal standpoint.
I also had the contract to do all the inaugural items for his inauguration in 1993. And then he did his Christmas shopping Christmas Eve twice in my store in Union Station. They would come in first with the dogs and Secret Service, and then he would come in to the shop. And just so happened I wasn't there either time. I was back in North Carolina with my family, and I had people working there then. But there was a great picture. I had this wonderful Roosevelt from 1936 poster, the gallant leader. That was the phrase on the poster. And it was big. It's like a 4 by 5 foot poster in the back. The way Union Station stores were designed, you had these glass doors and they folded back. And so while he was looking in the cabinet at some of the merchandise, the reflection of Roosevelt was on the glass door. And a photographer took a picture, and it's Roosevelt looking down on Clinton. And so it was in the Washington Post, and it was chosen as the photograph of the year by the Washington Press Association. And because it just captured Roosevelt looking down approvingly at Clinton and him buying memorabilia. He still was a collector, and a lot of my Truman things I had sold him. I visited the White House and the Oval Office during his presidency, and he had a framed set of the Truman buttons on the wall between the Oval Office and the little dining room next to the Oval Office.
That's quite a photo op. I'm wondering if it was just a coincidence or if it was somewhat planned.
Well, I think the photographer saw it and thought, wow. And he captured it. When he took the shot, you couldn't see the poster in the background. You just saw it on the window. So it just reflected down on Clinton. It was just it was the front page of the Photographer Association awards that year. It was on the front cover.
It's amazing. So I want to dive into your collection a bit, and I'm wondering, generally speaking, which items either in your collection now or formerly in your collection would you say stand out from the rest in terms of their significance or their wow factor? What leaps to mind?
Well, I think I sold one during COVID. I had the 1963 Lincoln Continental convertible that John Kennedy had ridden in the morning of November 22nd, 1963. I had gone to a Kennedy auction in Boston, and they had 2 Kennedy cars for sale. One was his armored White House limousine, which was a black Lincoln Continental, and it was part of the motor pool, and it stayed in Washington. It didn't travel. And the other one was probably the last time ever that a president rode in a common car, not a presidential limousine. He had 5 stops in Texas. And earlier in the day, on the 21st, he had been in Austin, and they flew the presidential limousine, the one that he actually was assassinated in, on to Dallas because he was going to be getting in late to Fort Worth. He had an early morning speech to the Chamber of Commerce that morning. And they went to the Secret Service to a local dealer and said, do you have a car we can use to pick up the president at the airport midnight almost and take him to the hotel in downtown Fort Worth and then bring him back to the airport the next morning? And they did.
Jim's passion for history comes through clearly when he describes the details of the Lincoln and its role in the final 2 days of Kennedy's life.
It was a beautiful white, red interior. And so the night of the 21st, it picked President Kennedy and First Lady up. And it was about a 12, 15-minute ride into downtown Fort Worth. And they got into the hotel room. And the room had been decorated with all kinds of artwork by the local art society. And the next morning, Kennedy gets up. Jackie stays in the room. He goes down early, and he's introduced outside to a rally in front of the hotel. Jim Wright introduces him, and it had been raining. And there you see a lot of the video is the white limousine sitting in front of the hotel waiting to, as soon as he finishes with the speech, the chamber, he was getting in the car, going to the airport and flying the 10 or 15 minutes to Dallas on Air Force One. Well, in the room the next morning before he left, Secret Service had put 2 phones in the room. And he called the lady who was the chair of the Art Society to thank her for all the art they had decorated the bedroom with. That was the last phone call he made. And I own both those telephones. I bought those at auction. And so he goes out, he gets in the car. The sun had come out after the rain. They put the top down, and he gets in the car. Jackie gets in, he gets in, and Governor Connally. And Jackie is between Governor Connally and President Kennedy. All 3 of them are in the back seat. Now, this is not a limousine. This is a regular Lincoln Continental, right? And they go to the airport in Fort Worth. There's a big crowd along the road on the way there. And the films, when you see him, when he gets to the airport and he gets out of the car and he walks over to the fence, shaking hands and thanking people, you realize in the videos then that that's the last car he will ever get out of. He flies then the 10 or 15 minutes, 12 minutes to Dallas, and then within an hour of getting out of that car, then he has been assassinated.
Jim bought the Lincoln at auction, along with the aforementioned presidential limousine that had been flown to Texas for Kennedy's visit.
They had the other limousine at the same auction. So I went and looked at both cars, and I thought, well, I think I'll bid, because at that point I had a traveling exhibition on President Kennedy that traveled. I had a 707 that I had outfitted the fuselage the same way it was the day that Kennedy had been assassinated. And so it was traveling around to state fairs and big events and inaugurations and conventions. And so I thought if I had one of the Kennedy cars, that'd really make the exhibition. So I bid on the first car, which was less valuable, the black armored limousine. And I won it for a lot less than I thought I would at the auction. And then the big sale of the day was the Kennedy limousine that he had in Fort Worth. And so I started bidding on that. And I learned years ago that when you're at an auction, never sit in the back and bid. Always sit on the front and just wave from your chair. Don't hold your hand up and if you're in the back and somebody's bidding against you, you take it personally and you say, they're not going to outbid me. When you're in front, you're not looking at who's bidding behind you. So you don't look back and you don't get personal with it. And they don't know who's been bidding either because your hand's way down, those in the back. So I learned that.
Jim's auction house power move proved successful, but with a couple of hefty price tags attached.
And I thought, oh my God, I don't have anywhere near enough of the money to buy these 2 cars. And I didn't know what to do. I was so happy that I'd gotten them, but I didn't know how I'm going to pay for them. And you have so many days, to pay for everything. So I had to come back home to North Carolina and get some friends and family to loan me the money to buy the cars. And eventually got the cars delivered to me. And the car that was used in Fort Worth, this was in October, and a month later was going to be the 50th anniversary. This is 2013. And so I had the car delivered to Fort Worth put on display right in front of the hotel where it had sat 50 years before. Congressman Jim Wright came and saw the car. He spoke that morning at the Chamber of Commerce 50 years later, where he had introduced Kennedy, and he came and had his picture made with me at the car. And I had it moved then over to Love Field, where Kennedy's had flown out of and back to Washington, his body was. And Prince Albert from Monaco came and toured the car and the airplane. I had the Kennedy airplane there also on display.
And in a case of one set of presidential memorabilia leading to another, a few years back, Jim found himself in a unique position to acquire about 800 pieces that once belonged to Franklin Roosevelt.
I live across from the Supreme Court in a house, and I decorated this house, rented it, called the Presidential House, and I covered the walls with signed letters from presidents and photographs of presidents and documents. And so I rented the house out for fundraisers. So they'd do congressional fundraisers. They would come. Well, you could buy anything on the wall at a registry, and then people could purchase these collectibles. So I made money from the collectibles. So I had this gentleman who lived in my basement who was retired military, and he was attacked and he died. He was attacked in front of the apartment right on East Capitol across from Supreme Court, and he died. And so I was the only person who knew him. We tried to find his family. We couldn't. And so the newspaper people saw it who had served with him in World War II in Korea. They contacted me, and we had the funeral at Arlington Cemetery. And so I got to be friends with one of the men. Well, a year or so later, he called me and he said, Jim, I have inherited Grace Tully estate. Grace Tully was the personal secretary to Franklin Roosevelt when he was governor of New York, and then when he came to the White House. She lived in the White House the whole time that he was president. And he had inherited this, and he said, it's 2 apartments. And the niece of Grace Tully had been related to this gentleman. And he said, if you want to come over and look at the items and see if there's something that you would like, I know you have the political memorabilia stores. So I could not go, but I had another collector and appraiser go and look at it. And he gave me a price. He said, if you offer him $5,000, you'll be okay. You'll be able to sell it.
The offer was accepted. And later, when Jim took possession of the items, he was floored.
There were documents, letters, things that were on Roosevelt's desk, the little Fala dog that was on his desk, the clock that was on his desk when Pearl Harbor was bombed. And so when I'm pulling this stuff out, I thought, oh my God, this is worth more than the $5,000. So I heard about the auction in New York with Guernsey Auction House that had handled another Kennedy auction a few years before. And I contacted him. He said, I'll come down the next day. I'll look at the collection. And I said, well, there are 2 other people. There were 2 apartments. I split one apartment with the fellow that I know, and the other apartment, the man that the woman worked for, the niece, he got an apartment. And I said, I think they're selling their things on eBay. And he said, call them, tell them to stop and meet at your house tomorrow morning. I'll fly down from New York. So he flies down. I have the stuff everywhere. And so he said, I don't want to see it yet. So he tells us about selling Hank Aaron's baseball for $3 million. And so he asked me to, the day before, have them bring something, a sample of what they have from the collection. So we're at the table, and he says, what do you have? And this gentleman who owned the print shop, I just met him that morning. He handed me an envelope, and David pulled out this document, and the document said, this day will live in infamy. It was one of the 4 copies of the Roosevelt speech for Pearl Harbor.
Oh, my goodness.
And so the auctioneer said, we got to take this to auction. And so we all agreed. And I had told the fellow that sold me mine for $5,000, I said, I owe you more money. This thing's worth a lot more than that. And he said, well, we'll see. We'll see.
To make a long story short, the FDR trove was auctioned off, but then returned due to some financial irregularities on the part of the buyer. A few years later, Jim tried again and auctioned off the majority of it successfully.
I wanted something for my family. Now I have more than I need, but since I sold a lot at auction in New York, and his leg brace. There were 3 pictures of him on the beach, never seen before, with shorts on, with a Secret Service agent, that people never saw his legs, how withered they were. And there were 2 or 3 letters from his mistress that happened to be in there. There were a lot of letters, and Eleanor letters, photographs, and signing pens, and catalogs of trips that they took overseas, and a lot of signed documents. It was just a trove of wonderful. It should have all been kept together and put at Hyde Park, I thought. So I still have quite a few of those. But so I had the bug by that time of buying collections, and then got into buying the Kennedy items.
That's amazing. And you're making a good argument for getting into presidential collectibles, I think.
Well, the price never goes down on presidential collectibles. And you can imagine, 50 years from now, a Kennedy piece will be like an Abraham Lincoln piece is today. And more people collect and know the value of things now. So I hope they do, because I hate to see any kind of presidential artifact, lost to, history without being shared with other people.
Mm-hmm. And you mentioned Abraham Lincoln. Do you have anything from him?
I did have. I had a signed document that I sold at auction during COVID with Bonham's Auction House in New York. And that's where I sold the Kennedy car with Bonham's in New York. We were going to do it, and then COVID hit, and we postponed it. And we were going to have it at Trump Tower because their office was next door, and we were going to use the lobby. I was going to put an Oval Office, full-size Oval Office. I have 5 Oval Offices, and I rent those out for movie sets. I have a Reagan 707 Boeing outfitted the way that it was when Reagan was president, which travels also. I had First Lady's gowns. It's got bigger and bigger from collecting buttons. I have thousands of items, and I have 1.2 million campaign buttons, political campaign buttons, in storage. I spend a fortune on storage each month. In Georgia, North Carolina, and Virginia, I must have 8 storage and an airplane hangar in Georgia with the 2 airplanes, 2 53-foot trailers full of exhibits for when I did a JFK Experience show. So it's, and I can't keep up with all of it. I'm going to die, and my yard's going to have prairie dog holes in it where people have been digging to see if I've hidden anything in the yard. I know that.
I'll say, just more buttons.
More buttons. Everybody said for years, throw all those buttons away. And I said, no, they become more valuable every year. These were buttons that I had designed for campaigns starting with Reagan. So they're 40-some years old, and the value keeps going up. They're like crypto. Just sit on them and wait. And what's going to happen, though, I'm going to die before they get sold, and my family's just going to throw that stuff away.
A bigger picture question here. Do you admire all of the presidents whose items you've collected, or is it more about the office of the presidency than the specific office holders?
Really, I do admire certain, my heroes would be, Jefferson, Lincoln, Teddy Roosevelt, Franklin Roosevelt, Kennedy, but the most effective for me was actually Johnson did more, I think. When I opened my store, I was a big Hubert Humphrey fan. And so I bought everything Hubert Humphrey to sell in my store. Well, little did I realize I was probably the only person who was the biggest fan of Hubert Humphrey. And so his stuff never sold. Nixon stuff sold like crazy. Young people bought Richard Nixon items because they saw him as kind of an outsider fighting against the system or something. I don't know. But Nixon stuff was more collectible. When they did the anniversary of the Watergate 20 years after, the hotel across the street, the Howard Johnsons, where the Watergate break-in group had operated, that room was still there. And so they had me decorate the room with artifacts from the Watergate period, from the hearings. And I had a set of buttons of each member of the Judiciary Committee that had never been pulled together with all of them. And so Gordon Liddy, I was there with Gordon Liddy when he did a radio show out of it. And so since then, they've torn that down. But I think that the presidency, and I have to say, in particular, certain presidents that there's some that I'm not too fond of, but we all have some that don't fit, right?
Yeah. So I want to switch gears and talk about how the sale of many of the commemorative items you've collected have helped fund a commemoration of another kind. At what point did you conceive of the Millworkers Monument in your hometown?
Well, David, my mother would get up early in the morning before daylight, and we lived out in a rural area. And she went to work in the mill at the age of 16 in a hosiery mill. She worked 33 years at the same sewing machine. And I would look out the window and she would be waiting on a ride to come around the curve, and the lights would come, and we didn't have a car. And so she would get in that car and go to work. And so I realized when I was visiting the local museum a few years ago back in the little hometown that I had grown up in, they had pictures of the mill owners on the wall, but they didn't have really pictures or a story on the mill workers. So I said, why don't you have more on the mill workers? And he said, well, why don't you come up with something? So I did. I started the Workers Legacy Foundation, and it had 5 parts. First part was to capture interviews with mill workers before they passed on, because, only in 10 years from now, they'll all be gone who worked during that period. The second one was set up a college scholarship at the local community college in my mother's name, Mary Warlick. And third was to do an exhibition on the history of the industrialization in mills. And something that was tender to me was child labor. We had child labor. Kids 8 years old worked in those mills. The other was to do a monument, to build a monument and recognize furniture workers, which was big, Drexel, Broyhill, all those. We were the furniture capital of the world in that area. And hosieries, where my mother worked, and textiles. And I had a designer design a monument, and the people who owned the old mill where my grandfather had worked gave me the whole top of that old mill they were renovating to put in a museum on mill workers. But since the building was now a National Historic Site, the Park Service had to approve the monument. And the monument at that point was 24 feet high. My mother was going to be in the middle, a man representing furniture on her right, and a lady representing textile workers on the left. And so the city had approved it, but the Park Service said, no, it can't be bigger than life size. And I said, well, you've got a Confederate monument downtown. It's 30 feet high. You think you could let mill workers be bigger than life, because they are to a lot of us. And so I wouldn't accept that. So I go to the museum, which was up the street, which is great because when you come into town, you have to pass that museum. They approved it, and we dedicated it in May with about 400 people. And my mother is in the center. And then one of the people who represents textile workers, Anne Forney Ramsewer, is still alive. She's 86. She spoke at the dedication. And so what's a rarity is that you have an African-American on a monument in the South, that you have someone who's still alive who is on a monument, and she's 2 blocks away from Confederate soldier, which they taken down. They didn't put it up until 1905 anyway. So as much as I hated selling the Kennedy car, my heart now was doing this Millworkers project because they had not been honored. And so they have been now.
Yeah. It's a great story. And what I really like about it is your stewardship of this other aspect of history. And you're taking other history, which you've invested in, and taking that investment and kind of redirecting it towards something that's not only worthy of celebration, but also a personal connection for you. And I think that's a pretty unique situation.
Yeah, thank you. It's been so much fun interviewing these people. And the final part of the 5 is we're doing a documentary, and we're trying to get the school system to allow us to bring in a teacher and teach the kids in the 8th grade and then the whole county about the history of the mill workers, and come to the museum to see. And because my exhibition has interviews of people, it has pictures of the child labor. And it's positive, but it also shows that it was hard work. And the monument's called the dignity of work, that whatever work you do, if it's legal, there's dignity in work, and these people deserve to be honored for it.
Absolutely. So I'm going to pivot again, and I have one last question for you. In recent years, the political climate in our country seems to be more divisive and contentious than ever. And maybe this is a stretch, but do you think that your collection and exhibitions of presidential memorabilia can play a role in helping to offset some of that divisiveness and bring people back to the notion of our history being one that's shared?
Oh, I think it's a great question. When I traveled with the JFK show, David, and when I traveled with the Reagan airplane, we interviewed people because everybody will tell you where they were on November 22nd, 1963, if they were alive then, or they heard their parents talk about it. We would capture those stories. It was nonpartisan. And so our show was nonpartisan. We wanted it to be about the presidency, the magnanimity of the presidency and democracy. And so at those state fairs and locations, we got that. I do fear now because in my store, we sell presidential items, still the collectibles, and we sell stuff from previous administrations. So we would have Clinton stuff in the store after he was gone, and then Bush, and then Obama and Trump. But I have to tell you that this election, we probably will not have Biden and Trump stuff because some of the customers, they were getting mad because we had Obama items and we said he's a former president and first lady. And, we still honored them too. And my employees constantly were telling me that people were, upset about that. And so now people are upset if we had Trump stuff in the store. And so we've had to decide that this coming presidential year, I may do a presidential button poll with the two candidates that's nonpartisan, and then they can buy the button for their choice, and we'll release that to the press. Because I did that out in Iowa in 1988. I started doing a presidential poll, and I would predict who would win. And when people know that their vote is going to be recorded as a vote released to the press, they'll buy the candidate that they want. And you can call people on the telephone. They'll tell you they're voting for somebody, but when they put their money where their mouth is for that candidate. And so my prediction in Iowa in 1988, I got it better than NBC and CBS polls based on my polling in the shopping center where I had a setup. And so it got a lot of, reporting. So it eliminates people that are apathetic. Apathetic people don't buy political buttons and they don't vote. And so people that are voters buy the button and they buy the button for that candidate. So I may do that as a nonpartisan poll, but, I've been scared off, and I hope that we get back to a day when we just respect people who run for the presidency and have been president. I'm hopeful. Yeah.
And I hope we respect the power of buttons as prognosticators for elections.
That's right. That's right.
Well, Jim, I want to thank you for taking the time to chat with me about your incredible journey as not only a seller of presidential memorabilia, but also a collector of some really significant, amazing pieces over the years, and how it's all led you to the Millworkers Monument in North Carolina. It's been a great story to hear about. I appreciate you talking about it.
Well, thank you. I'm honored to be on your show and the chance to share the story of the millworkers too.
You bet.
Thank you. I enjoyed it.
All right. Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Well, with collectibles front and center, Jim Warlick's nonpartisan tributes to the American presidency are a tribute to his own appreciation for U.S. history. And if all politics is local, as the saying goes, then maybe the same is true for history, with Jim parlaying his knack for commemorating the presidency's past into pursuing the personally meaningful tribute to millworkers in his hometown, even rendering his mother a larger-than-life hero in the process. For Keeps is a production of me, David Peterkowski. My thanks to Jim Warlick for chatting with me about his odyssey as both a buyer and seller of presidential memorabilia, as well as his efforts to commemorate millworkers through his Workers' Legacy Foundation. At forkeepspodcast.com, you'll see photos of Jim, as well as some of the standout pieces from his collection. The show's theme song is by Still Flyin, and the closing theme is by Eric Frisch. Additional music for this episode was by Blue Dot Sessions. Thanks for listening to For Keeps. Until next time, keep on keeping on.